It's about Georgia and 10 other countries, so you can see there is a lot of knowledge in it. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here to launch this report. It's a product of a great deal of work, but it's also an example, an excellent example of cooperation on a regional level. Now, the countries reviewed in this report, they vary widely, not only in terms of size and energy endowment, but also levels of national sovereignty and political and economic structures. However, they have a shared history from which they have inherited significant similarities in national economic design, governance structure, public institutions, and infrastructure. That said, over the past two decades, alongside political and economic developments, a diversity of regional preferences continues to emerge based on each country's political and economic interests and aspirations. For example, the countries east of the Caspian Sea have substantially strengthened economic and trade ties with markets in Asia. Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia signed an EU association agreement in June 2014. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan and Belarus opted to establish the Russian Federation-led Eurasian Customs Union 2010, joined by Armenia from January 2015, and soon to be joined by Kyrgyzstan and possibly Tajikistan. Unfortunately, throughout these transformations, the energy sector has suffered. Energy markets that were originally set up to suit central planning were no longer effective. And one of the most illustrative examples is the Central Asian power grid, which was built to serve all 5 republics in the region and continued functioning after independence, overlooking the new economic and political realities. And these new realities prompted political tension in the region and resulted in the Central Asian economies isolating their energy systems, moving away from a regional market set up by consolidating their domestic power transmission systems in a bid to maintain higher levels of energy supply security. However, isolation and rigid thinking are not in the region's long-term best interest. And the way forward for these countries is cooperation and evidence-based strategic planning for a sustainable future. Setting up these fully functional domestic energy markets and maximizing energy potential have proved difficult. And this continues to be the key focus for many governments in the region. And while most of the countries have a large body of energy sector legislation in place, implementations remain challenging. And this is due in most cases to a lack of well-elaborated secondary legislation, detailing rules and procedures for sector governance alongside concerns for rule of law. And such legislation could go a long way to making better use of the significant energy resources in the region. And the reviewed countries in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia, share abundant hydrocarbon, hydro, and renewable energy source wealth concentrated around the Caspian and Black Sea basins. Giant oil and gas fields place the Caspian region among the richest worldwide with proven oil and gas reserves. And Kazakhstan and Ukraine also possess large coal deposits. Belarus is rich in peat. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and Georgia top the list of countries with ample hydro resources. Total primary energy supply in producing countries is dominated by natural gas and coal in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan are significant gas producers, while Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan are also significant in oil production. Ukraine and Kazakhstan are the main coal producers, and these countries are self-sufficient on energy, while the others, including Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia and Tajikistan, are import dependent. Ukraine is dependent on natural gas imports, but not on coal. Renewable energy is mainly in the form of large hydro, built during the Soviet Union, and in countries, of course, which have abundant water resources. However, these countries experience high seasonality of energy supply. Biofuels are significant in Georgia and Moldova. However, the exact use of biofuels in most of these countries is likely underestimated. And then there's nuclear power. Nuclear power is used as reliable baseload generation capacity in Ukraine and Armenia. However, Armenia's reactor has to be refurbished in the next few years in order to remain operational. I think it's 2026, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Deputy Minister. To 2020. Exactly, exactly. Now, these regions are also considered rich in unconventional oil and gas reserves. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan also have large uranium and rare earth deposits and remain among the largest uranium suppliers to world markets. And the exact potential for renewable resources in these regions has yet to be fully assessed. However, current projections and renewables mapping put in place by a number of these countries and these economies provide promising forecasts. In addition to sizable alternative and renewable sources of energy, well, the potential for energy efficiency gains, as you pointed out, Mr. Ambassador, is vast and remains largely untapped. The contribution of modern renewables also remains marginal across the regions, hindered mainly by the energy sector's inability to attract investors due to evident price competition. Let's have a look at electricity generation. There, natural gas is used in most countries, except for hydropower-rich Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. However, it is the most dominant fuel in 5 countries: Uzbekistan, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Moldova. Ukraine and Armenia have nuclear power as base load, while Ukraine is also reliant on coal. And Kazakhstan is also reliant on coal due to its abundant resources. Oil is hardly used in power generation. Hydropower is the main source of electricity in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia, and as I mentioned, this causes high seasonality in electricity supply and winter shortage supply security threats. Renewables other than large hydro are negligible, and the most significant development in non-large hydro renewables have been small hydro power plants in hydropower-rich countries. Well, is this primary energy mix likely to change drastically in the near to long term? No, I don't think so. Little progress has been achieved towards more sustainable energy use, but some countries have set very ambitious goals for renewable energy and primary source diversification. Kazakhstan, with its goal of having 50% share of alternative and renewable sources in its primary energy mix by 2050, while Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are aiming at their declared energy efficiency and renewable targets for 2020. Azerbaijan has achieved a significant decrease in energy intensity in all sectors of its economy, and that is thanks to the replacement of oil with natural gas and the installation of new energy efficient technologies in electricity production. Meanwhile, those countries party to the Russian-led customs union are increasingly considering installing new or expanding existing nuclear capacity to enhance their primary energy mix. It has to be mentioned that energy intensity here has been falling, mainly due to economic growth, which has outpaced energy demand. Now, in some countries, this decoupling is due to insufficient energy infrastructure, and economic growth has not translated in better quality of supply. And as such, demand growth has been slower, not more efficient. And energy savings potential in these countries remains high, and targeted actions at curbing demand and improving energy efficiency are likely to result in more impressive energy intensity declines. But of course, this all depends on planning for the future. At more than 2 decades since gaining independence, most of the reviewed countries remain focused on current affairs, and very little attention is being paid to formulating well-elaborated visions for energy policy. Now, some countries like Kazakhstan and Moldova have aligned ambitious targets for energy sector development with their general economic outlook and developmental goals. And meanwhile, the long-term energy policy directions of Belarus, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan continue their paths of planned developments aimed mainly at system reliability, planned growth and reduction of energy intensity of their respective economies. Armenia and Kyrgyzstan require further elaboration on their approved energy sector development concepts, whereas Azerbaijan, Georgia, Tajikistan need to replace their dated energy sector strategies with new medium to long-term strategies to implement their declared sustainable development goals. And Ukraine's recently updated energy strategy to 2030, approved in June 2013, also needs to be revised to adapt to new realities, elaborating on the pressing need for swift restructuring and robust energy sector reforms. Now, most countries appear to be setting their energy policy preferences based on annual GDP growth targets rather than on actual energy statistics-based growth potential or sector performance patterns. And unfortunately, this policy design approach neglects the substantial improvements made by all reviewed countries in energy statistics data gathering in recent years. And further, the emphasis on energy data collection remains on the supply side, even though there is a strong need for accurate demand-side data collection, as you are doing here in Georgia. You are doing that. The management and integration in the national energy balances. And as mentioned before, there's huge potential for energy efficiency and renewables in all sectors, particularly in district heating, electricity generation and networks, industry and buildings. You know, ladies and gentlemen, if these countries were to use energy as efficiently as OECD countries do, primary energy consumption in the Caspian region as a whole would be cut by 1/2. Now, how quickly this energy efficiency potential might be exploited hinges largely on government policies, especially on energy pricing. Most countries subsidize at least one form of energy. It hinges on market reform and improved access to financing for energy projects. Unfortunately, energy efficiency governance remains vague in almost all the reviewed countries, and a clear definition of the role of local governments in energy efficiency policy implementation is therefore of prime importance. The placement of a dedicated, independent public authority in charge of energy efficiency policies and measures, with license to oversee the implementation of those policies, could ensure that energy efficiency is a strategic priority and could provide greater coordination. A positive development has been the promotion of renewable energy, where considerable progress has been observed across the regions. And most countries have put in place detailed strategies and financial support mechanisms and have relaxed investment procedures for renewable energy development. However, these procedures have not yet proven sufficient to reach the expected level of renewable technology deployment. One common barrier to policy implementation is the absence of secondary legislation which would elaborate on legal, regulatory and financial mechanisms and on clear and enforceable technical rules for grid integration. And policy development could also greatly benefit from cost-benefit analysis, considering all renewable resources and available technologies with competitive advantages. And we think that this would help governments further develop renewable energy strategies and promote sector development. And yet, despite the security risks, the energy security risks, the three regions remain highly energy intensive, reflecting continued gross inefficiency in energy use, as well as climatic and structural economic factors. But of course, where there are challenges, there are also opportunities. And many of the decisions made on the energy mix relate to energy security, and that's understandable. And the priority in import-dependent countries has been diversifying import sources and routes to minimize dependence on one single source. And although recurrent supply shortages indicate a need for reliable primary or alternative fuel storage structures, this costly option has not yet been considered as a measure for enhanced energy security. Now, recent developments in Ukraine have drawn attention to the importance of sound emergency response procedures, with well-elaborated demand restraint programs for import-dependent countries. And although industry is able to deal with wide-ranging, short technical faults in the system, backed by reliable technical procedures, a larger supply disruption response mechanism is yet to be put in place in most import-dependent countries in these regions. And that said, access to energy is very high in the reviewed countries. However, there is strong evidence that despite such a high electrification rate, access to modern energy services is limited in some countries, particularly outside large cities and in the remote regions where incomes are generally lowest. Average electricity consumption per capita in the residential sector in the region is low, and there are regular incidents of load shedding and brownouts, particularly in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. And these incidents in import-dependent countries are due mostly to generating fuel shortages in the supply countries. For example, low reservoir levels and poor hydrological conditions in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan provoke electricity shortages and cut-offs during the winter months. So although levels of electrification and access are high, both, the energy infrastructure itself is aging and requires a high level of maintenance, modernization and rehabilitation throughout the energy supply chain. And the large capital investments required are particularly difficult to mobilize under the current pricing and regulatory structures in countries where prices remain below cost recovery levels. Fixed energy infrastructure, including centralized district heating systems and natural gas and power transmission and distribution networks, are most at risk. And a lack of investments resulting in further inefficiencies and loss of capacity over time could put energy security in further peril. And so the report covers a wide range of countries. Today I'd like to focus on the 3 countries from the Caucasus. And of course we start with Georgia. Georgia's main energy policy direction is hydropower development to phase out thermal generation, reduce reliance on hydrocarbon imports, meet domestic demand, and expand electricity exports to neighboring markets. And the new Georgian electricity market model, when implemented, will bring Georgia more in line with the EU market and facilitate higher electricity exports from Georgia to Turkey and further to European markets via Turkey. And recommendations for Georgia include the strengthening of the national regulatory authority and electricity market opening as country develops a new market model. And despite vast biomass, solar, wind and geothermal resources, Georgia is lagging in the development of other renewables and lagging in the area of energy efficiency where no legislation is even drafted at present. So it's important that Georgia develops a comprehensive energy strategy to 2030 and beyond. And this requires high-level government commitment in elaborating the key theses of the current draft strategy further, in consultation, of course, with all energy stakeholders. And the new energy policy should include an analysis of a variety of scenarios and the use of different energy resources, with a focus on maximizing renewable energy and maximizing energy efficiency gains, while at the same time providing affordable and secure energy in line with national and international commitments. And another important aspect the government would need to focus on is energy research. Energy research, development and deployment. You know, none of the reviewed countries have clear policies for promoting national research and development capabilities. And to date, the share of the public support of this sector remains limited. And Georgia, like other countries in this region, has dedicated scientific and research centers for energy with very little or no funding for technology research and development. And neglecting this important area discouraged the growth of a new generation of scientists and researchers and impedes development of homegrown technologies. So to invest in research and development is to invest in the future. Let's have a look at Armenia. Armenia's economy has undergone numerous reforms since an economic crisis in the early to mid-1990s. And lacking indigenous resources, Armenia imports natural gas and oil for most of its energy needs, mainly from Russia. And prompted by a severe electricity supply crisis in the mid-90s, Armenia has revamped its energy sector over the past 20 years. And this has led to ample investments in capacity networks, which has improved reliability considerably. So recommendations for Armenia include continuing the development of energy policy reform and building of interconnections, and strengthening energy efficiency measures, particularly in buildings and transports. Azerbaijan's economy has experienced exceptional growth over the past decade, an economy heavily dependent on energy exports, with more than 90% of total exports accounted for by oil and gas. And the current government is making renewables a priority, with an ambitious target of 20% renewables in electricity generation by 2020. And this report includes recommendations that Azerbaijan develops a comprehensive sustainable energy strategy, expedites structural policy reforms to move towards competitive markets, and develops an effective energy efficiency strategy. And of course, we do not have time to go into detail for all of the countries that were studied, but I will take a few minutes to share with you some highlights from the other two regions. In Eastern Europe, despite the lack of natural resources and the economic crisis that it had to overcome after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Belarus has achieved solid economic growth through manufacturing and exports. However, little structural reform has occurred in the country since its independence, and there are relatively low levels of foreign investments. So we recommend that Belarus ensures a predictable investment climate, phases out energy subsidies, and promotes grid integration of reliable renewables. Moldova's economy has experienced moderate growth over the past decade, and yet it's highly reliant on international donors and remittances from a large number of overseas workers. Moldova lacks energy resources and is almost wholly dependent on imports of fossil fuels and electricity. So recommendations for Moldova include to continue on the path of energy policy reforms, develop feed-in tariffs for renewable energy investments, and improve energy statistics and data collection. And then Ukraine. Ukraine is located at crossroads of the European Union, Russian Federation, and Black Sea and Caspian regions. It holds abundant mineral resources, including oil, natural gas, coal, as well as a large hydro and biomass potential. And it also remains the largest transit country for natural gas in the world and plays a key role for Russian gas deliveries to European markets. However, Ukraine has undergone two severe economic crises in the past 5 years and faces continuing security threats. This report includes recommendations that Ukraine rethinks its short, medium and long-term energy strategies in line with current realities, that it undertakes energy market reform and enhances domestic gas production. But the report also covers 5 countries from Central Asia. Kazakhstan, among the world's 10 fastest growing economies, has experienced strong growth over the past 2 decades, mainly through resource development, export-oriented policies. And we recommend that Kazakhstan continues to develop a national fuel and energy strategy to 2030 with an outlook to 2050 and ensures stable, predictable, fair and transparent investment procedures. Kyrgyzstan, reliant on imports of oil and gas for more than half of its energy needs, particularly during the winter months when hydro production is low. And among other recommendations, the report calls for Kyrgyzstan to develop a comprehensive rate structure for electricity and heat tariffs and raise public awareness on the real cost of electricity and the possible increase in tariffs. Tajikistan is almost exclusively reliant on hydro for its electricity generation. And despite reasonable energy potential, Tajikistan's energy sector is prone to supply shocks, particularly during winter months. We have several recommendations for Tajikistan, including to provide affordable energy, deal with winter shortages, and ensure the application of clean coal technologies. Turkmenistan, one of the largest gas resource holders in the Caspian region, and it holds significant volumes of recoverable oil. So the government is continuing to invest in the oil and gas sector, including a large project to modernize and expand the electricity and heat sector by 2020. And this report includes recommendations for Turkmenistan to streamline the energy sector governance, develop robust energy saving and energy efficiency policies, and continue to phase out energy subsidies while protecting, and this is very important of course, while protecting the most vulnerable end users. Uzbekistan, rich in natural gas resources, the third largest gas producer in the region. But despite energy self-sufficiency, Uzbekistan's aging electricity infrastructure and network underinvestments have led to electricity shortages, poor efficiency, high losses and lack of reliability. So the report recommends Uzbekistan to take more aggressive actions for rehabilitation and replacement of the aging energy infrastructure and to continue the development of the country's vast solar potential. Now, apart from country-specific recommendations, the report also lays out a series of recommendations across all regions, across all countries. On general energy policy, countries really should prepare comprehensive sustainable energy strategies for the horizon beyond 2015 and revise or develop medium to long-term energy scenarios, making best use of energy data. Sustainable energy policy reforms or development must continue, including transparent implementation and enforcement of energy legislative frameworks. And for the future, I mentioned it, research and development activities should continue for smart investments in conventional and alternative energy developments. And then, of course, there's energy security. On energy security, there is a need for increasing production outputs, both in terms of conventional and unconventional sources. A need for maximizing efficiency gains and upgrading energy infrastructures, and investments into the energy supply chain, they should be encouraged through competitive, fair and transparent regulatory frameworks and market price incentives. And emergency response mechanisms should be developed, possibly including fuel storage build-ups for import-dependent countries. And collectively, the countries should review the markets, particularly as new interconnections develop, and adapt market rules to enhance system operability, system interoperability, and remove regulatory and trade barriers. And discussions should begin on setting up regional markets with neighboring countries. And in part, this will mean strengthening the competencies and the independence of national regulatory authorities. In terms of sustainable development, countries should introduce balanced regulatory frameworks that promote renewable energy, including procedures for grid integration for variable renewables. And they should elaborate or boost implementation of energy efficiency plans, particularly for buildings, for transport, coordinate energy efficiency measures regionally, and at the same time strengthening initiatives at local and city levels to encourage energy savings. Now, you know, dear friends, underlying many of these challenges is one thing: money. need for investment. And of course, attracting investment has been a key focus of governments in these regions since gaining their independence. And one of the most successful changes in national legislation has been to liberalize fiscal structures to attract much-needed investment. And while initially based on project-by-project incentives, most of the countries have gradually moved to more widespread reforms. And the remaining impediments to attract investments or for upgrading and maintaining existing systems are tariff structures, where energy tariffs remain below cost recovery levels, and energy subsidies, which do not provide investors with the opportunity to recoup their investments. And we see that those countries that have opted for regulatory reforms, in addition to privatizing the energy sectors, have generated greater benefits for their populations and industry at large. So there is a need for open, stable, predictable, fair and transparent investment framework. And it will be necessary to mobilize investments into infrastructure and to improve the performance and efficiency of the energy supply chain. Dear Minister, dear Vice Minister, ladies and gentlemen, as we have seen, this report covers 3 vast regions with a wide variety of countries, and their challenges are sometimes shared, sometimes unique, much as their energy needs and resources vary. However, one goal they all share is the creation of a sustainable, affordable, secure energy system. And we sincerely hope that this report will pave the way for concrete, effective steps taken forward towards that goal. Now, on behalf of the IEA, International Energy Agency, I would like to thank the European Union for the opportunity to produce this report, INOGATE partner countries for their participation in the peer review, INOGATE Technical Secretariat for organizational and logistical support throughout the review process, Georgia's government for hosting 2 review meetings in 2012 and 2013. I think none of this would have been possible without such cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
მადლობა სულთით ხალბატონ მარია ვან დერ